Hey, I'm Jeff Perkins. These are the Soundstripe Sessions. This is a podcast about the space between inspiration and execution. That's where the real story lives. We sit down with world-class creators and storytellers to unpack the craft, the creative decisions, the roadblocks, and the breakthroughs that shaped their best work. For anyone who makes things and wants to make them better. Welcome. Today I want to welcome Noam Kroll to the podcast. Noam is an award-winning filmmaker, director, cinematographer, and guitarist based in Los Angeles. He got his start making short films and music videos and has gone on to direct feature films that have screened at international festivals. He also runs one of the most popular filmmaking blogs and podcasts on the internet at noamkroll.com, which has drawn millions of visitors. Noam, great to see you. Welcome to the Soundstripe Sessions.
Thank you so much. I'm a big fan of what you guys do, so I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. So let's start off. I always like to take our guests back and talk about the origin story. So tell us a little bit about where you're from, where you grew up, and how you got to where you are today.
Sure. So I grew up in Canada, in Toronto. I live in LA now, but I spent most of my life there until I was about 27, and 28 actually. I moved to LA, I always loved film. It really, I've told this story a little bit probably on my own podcast, but it really, I remember like some of the earliest memories of just watching like Looney Tunes and things as a kid, and just sitting so close to the TV and wanting to like be in the show or find a way to make stuff. And then Ace Ventura, Pet Detective was like, as funny as that is, that was like the first movie I saw where I was like, oh my God, this is crazy. I didn't know like a movie could be something like this. And I was like really young when I saw it. Made me want to get into maybe acting. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't even know what a director was. So as a kid, and as a teenager, I did a lot of acting while I was starting to like discover cameras and stuff like that. So I would, shoot a lot of stuff on the weekends with my friends on little, mini DV cameras, skateboarding videos, music videos, like anything I could kind of do. Little pranks. We'd make like school projects and do like stupid videos we'd show in our class. And then all the while I was like, going out as an actor, as a teenager, not knowing, again, what a director was, just kind of being naive about it, doing commercials and things like that myself. And then by the time I finished high school, I kind of realized like I really wanted to focus more on directing, and like I understood that was a job. At the same time, I'd been advised by some directors that I'd worked with, like on the acting side, to like consider maybe not going to film school and studying something else. Everybody has a different perspective on that, but that kind of resonated with me. So I ended up studying psychology, and getting a degree in that field while I was like making short films and freelancing as an editor and doing all this stuff on the side. And that was actually helpful in a lot of ways now, because, as a filmmaker, I really find psychology fascinating, and a lot of the characters and stories that I write are kind of based in psychological themes. So I'd studied all that, freelanced. I was kind of building a small production company in Canada, and eventually always knew I wanted to move down here, but it was just such a hurdle to go through that process. And now I'm a citizen, but I was not, and I had to go through all those steps. So that took me many, many years and lots of lawyer fees and different things to figure it out. Once I got here, I continued to kind of do what I was doing on the production company side, and doing these like service jobs for brands and making little commercials and things like that. But really what kind of changed things for me was when I started to focus more on things like blogging and social media and stuff like that, podcasting, by exploring that as an avenue like parallel to what I was doing in production. That allowed me to kind of document what I was doing, both on the commercial side, but also on the film side, because I was constantly making these shorts and eventually feature films. And those things ended up all going hand in hand. So now skip to, quite a few years later, I've been running the blog and podcast and my newsletter for a while. And, they continue to grow, but really they've been so helpful for me to connect with other filmmakers, to meet people and share what I've learned along the way. And it's indirectly led to multiple feature films now. I just released I guess, earlier this month. Our feature film Teacher's Pet, which is a low budget, but my biggest budget film to date. And that directly stemmed from connections that I made through these content channels. So that's kind of the big, long story from childhood to now. But hopefully that gives you kind of a rough picture of I guess, where I'm at today.
So, how many years ago did you move here from Canada?
13, I think 13 years in March.
Okay,
Yeah.
but you went
So
to school in Canada.
I did, yes.
Okay, which college did you go to?
I went to a school called York University, which is in Toronto, where I'm from. Always thinking I stayed local because I always thought every year I was gonna find a way to transfer to UCLA or something. And just as an international student, it was like very difficult and way too expensive. So I figured I'll finish there and then I'll move. But even that wasn't easy. So I was happy when that process was behind me for sure.
But you studied psychology, not
Yeah,
film in college.
that's right. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
is film all self-taught? You just picked it up along the way?
Yeah, film was just self-taught. It was just, taking whatever camcorder I could get and shooting stuff. I remember when, like, I was a kid, my mom had these, she's a speech therapist, and she had these VHS decks. Sometimes she would record her clients and use them to, like, make copies. And so I started to use these two VHS things to, like, make my own edits. And I would go on the weekend and shoot something and then, like, cut it on VHS tape, which was like super archaic and crazy. Most people listening won't even really understand what that means. But it was really, it was kind of my first time I realized, like, oh, you could cut stuff together. And then my friend hooked me up with a copy of Premiere that I don't know if I was supposed to have on my computer or not when I was in high school. And I started learning that. And then Final Cut. I worked in a couple of post houses over the years, just in like little stints to do this or that. But honestly, most of that was applying things that I already knew. Had YouTube existed in the form that it does now when I was younger, I would have had, a field day with it, but it wasn't out. So it was all trial and error and just, shooting something and editing it and usually looking terrible and then trying to do it again the next weekend and make it slightly better.
Yeah. Um, Watching some of your films, I'm surprised that one of your earliest influences was Ace Ventura: Pet Detective, because your films are intense. They're a bit dark. They're very well done. But I would have thought Silence of the Lambs or something more in the suspense horror genre. But you kind of threw me there because I mean you went to like the comedy side. So talk a little
Yeah.
bit about that influence and some of the other influences you had that as a filmmaker from the early days.
Totally. No, it's a great question. Well, so there were sort of two moments for me in two movies really that I remember as a kid seeing, and they were total opposite. They could not be more opposite. But one is being like 9 years old and seeing Ace Ventura, and just I think it was less about, like, sure, I found it hilarious and all the rest of it, but there was a couple of things. One, Jim Carrey grew up in an area called Newmarket, which is a suburb of Toronto that is like 30 minutes away from where I lived. So in my mind, I was like, oh, if there's somebody out there that could like come from up here in the suburbs and make their way into Hollywood, like maybe I could do that. So part of it was that. Part of it was I just thought the movie was hilarious. But the other part, I guess, is just that it just blew my mind that somebody could make a movie where they acted that ridiculous. I thought movies had to like be a little more formal in some way. And then, this is maybe 5 years later, I'm watching all sorts of stuff, comedies, dramas, whatever. But then I come across Requiem for a Dream. And that was the movie where I was like, oh, wow, you could do this too. That, again, was another like blew my mind sort of moment. Like you could do some really crazy stuff on film. Honestly, over the years, I always loved, it's weird. Like I love funny stuff. Like I'll go to a stand-up comedy show if I can, and I'll watch a lot of that kind of stuff. And I like comedy movies, but I think I just realized that like my sensibilities, as I experimented more with the craft of filmmaking, I was always really drawn to like Hitchcock stuff or, European like art films that were a little darker or, classic. Like I'm not so like, I like horror films, but I'm not necessarily like a diehard horror fan, but I like stuff that is, yeah, definitely like on the darker, creepier side. Like I just feel like when I see movies like that and I leave the theater after, I feel like in the same way that someone could go and see a comedy and leave and feel like they're in a good mood, I almost feel like I'm in a good mood when I see something really dark and intense, and then I leave the theater and I'm like, oh, okay, now like everyday life feels like very easy to me after watching that. So that's kind of the feeling that I would want to create with my own films, but I'm always open to other things. And actually, like last year, I did this thing just for fun with a friend of mine, Luke Barnett, who's an actor in Teacher's Pet. And we did this little short film together, and it was a comedy with no dialogue called Ovation. And that ended up being probably the most seen thing that I've ever done. We made it in 2 hours for $50 and just like called in some favors with friends. It went viral. It got premiered in Variety and got all this attention. But we couldn't have planned that. And that was like a comedy thing. So now that we're having this conversation, I'm wondering maybe I'm missing an opportunity. Maybe there's some link there. I don't know. But yeah, I'm just kind of following it, in terms of what my own instincts are, and I don't know if there's any real rhyme or reason to it, to be honest.
At what point when you were coming up, did you realize actually you could translate your passion for film into an actual career? Because a lot of people have a passion for film and they're really into movies, but then they kind of get stuck. They aren't able to figure out how to translate that into actually a career in film. How did you figure that out?
Such a good question. I did have that moment. And for me, it was less about understanding, because I still honestly don't understand the film business. It just doesn't make sense to me as a business. And I think, it's always changing, and there's always these stories coming out in the Hollywood Reporter about how things are collapsing. And really, if you're just strictly approaching it from a career standpoint, like the film business kind of doesn't make any sense, because the odds of like getting in, and you're either making no money, which is like 90% of people or 99% of people, or you strike it big with a movie, you're making a lot of money. But the days of, especially these days, it's not like even 20 or 30 years ago when people were making a living just as like a crew person, or as like a staff writer. Like that's becoming like less and less and less of that. So for me, it was, I've always been very entrepreneurial. So for me, the connection was thinking about filmmaking from the perspective of how can I have control over my own destiny when I'm making films, not only in terms of the films that I'm making, but also in terms of how I'm actually earning a living. So I was less, so approaching it as like there's a career path for me to break into Hollywood or to break into some industry, whatever that even really means, and then to kind of work my way up through that, because I just didn't think I could do that. I had no idea how. I still don't know how. But what I did know that I could do is I knew I could shoot stuff and I could edit stuff and I could cut things together and make videos for people. And I knew I could, send someone an email and say like, hey, you have a cool, fashion brand or whatever. Can I do a video for you? Or you have a cool band, I want to do a music video for you guys. And a lot of those people would respond and say like, sure, I do a video for them, and they would end up sending more work to me. So I think when I started to apply myself on a entrepreneurial level to filmmaking, which sometimes people feel like those are two different things, but I actually think they've always been very much connected for me at least. That really helped me not rely on getting a job, getting hired, working my way up any ladder. I kind of started where I was, very small, but I started doing what I ultimately would want to do, which is, making films and directing and doing all this stuff I would want to do on a big level. I just started on the tiniest level possible. And I've incrementally kind of like stepped up a little bit at a time. And that's still been my philosophy and model all these years later. I still have a lot of room to grow and a lot of things I'd like to do in the future, but it's very much based in like focusing on what I can control, kind of, using my own resources and abilities.
Was there a point on this journey when you were kind of like, this is too hard? I just, because you're your own boss, basically. You're going to go, you kind of have to go get new business constantly, new projects constantly. Was there ever a point where you're like, man, I'm just going to go find a corporate job? You took some classes as a psychologist. I'm going to just go be a psychologist. Did you ever think that? Or you're always like, man, I'm all in. This is what I'm going to do.
I've totally had those moments. Like I definitely would have those moments, constantly at points, but they would be sort of fleeting because whenever I would run through the scenario in my mind, I would realize I'm never going to get a job that's going to give me the things like it for me personally. And again, this is very different for everybody because some people thrive in a more structured environment and rise up to the top and make a lot of money and do, all the things that they want to do. But like when I dabbled in, like I said, working in post studios and things like that, I just realized that for better or for worse, I was always so much more motivated by like it's like that cliche kind of like expression that people say, but it's true. It's like, entrepreneurs are willing to work 80 hours a week to avoid working 40 hours a week. And that was kind of like me. Like I don't mind
That's great.
working in a way stupidly sometimes, and working more hours than I probably would if I had a regular job somewhere. But it's the freedom that it does give me, especially now, like having kids and being able to take a day off and like, take kids to somewhere for their birthday or, go volunteer at their school and like read a book to the library. Like those things are important to me. So based on, whenever I would have those moments of like doubt and I would kind of question, like, is there another path? I would think like, honestly, everything is hard. Like working, there's nothing's easy. Like being your own boss is not easy, but working in a corporate environment is not easy either. And it's just a matter of like kind of pick your poison. And for me, my strengths were really more, it was just evident over the years that I was more effective working for myself and I've always been motivated to wake up. I've worked from home since I was like a teenager basically and I moved out, but I've always been able to wake up in the morning and have an iced tea or whatever I need to get my brain working and sit down and just get to work. And some people find that really hard. I find other things hard. So yeah, so to answer your question, I've totally had those moments, but eventually I've realized that for better or for worse, I've kind of painted myself into this corner for a reason, and I'm just going to kind of continue to get deeper into what I'm doing and see where it goes from there.
What was the point on the journey where you kind of broke through and you realized, okay, I'm good. This is going to be hard, but I could make a career of this. There's a clear career path for me in doing what I'm doing.
Honestly, I think so. That's a great question because I don't know if there's any one point because I think every time I have that moment, then there's kind of a new plateau and then a new set of like existential crisis of like, oh, what about now? And then you have to kind of break through to whatever your next goal or level is. So there's those moments, but honestly, I would say the biggest thing for me was moving here because I had to apply for something called an O1 visa, which is an artist visa, and it's very difficult to get. And I looked into it. I remember meeting with this immigration lawyer, and he showed me like all this stuff I had to do, and I was like, "There's no way I'm going to qualify for this." So I spent like a year just hustling and pounding the pavement, calling people, doing volunteering for people, post supervising movies, judging for film festivals, like literally doing every single thing I could possibly do to strengthen my case. And then when I applied and got accepted, that was the first time I was like, oh, okay, this is cool because this is the same kind of visa that they would give to like an NBA player that they're hiring from Europe or something to put on an American team. So although it wasn't a financial breakthrough, it was actually cost money to go through that process. It was the first time, and I had many friends who tried to get that visa and didn't get it. And so that was the first time that I kind of felt like there was this external validation that I had achieved a certain bar of something that allowed me to move to the place I wanted to move. And then I think the part B of that story, if that's part A, part B was then moving here a couple months later and really being able to hit the ground running within a couple of months and work on like some amazing projects. There's a collaborator I'm working with on Monday who I met literally 2 or 3 days after moving here. I found that because I had that really big, challenge of having to get this visa and find a way to move and hustle and do all these things I normally wouldn't have had to do, it actually put me at a bit of an advantage when I came here because I'd made all these connections and resources that I wouldn't have otherwise had. So I think then seeing that, I was able to sustain myself while while again, I wish that everybody could, but there were other people I knew that had come out here and couldn't really make a living because it is really hard, and they had to leave, around the same time that I had been moving here, and it just made me realize that yeah, there was something there. I hadn't figured it out yet, and I still haven't. Like again, I'm still always like iterating on it, but something about that move here, I was like, okay, if nothing else ever happens good, I fulfilled my dream of like moving to LA, which I wanted to do since I was 10 years old. So if nothing else, that was like the biggest relief that I've probably had in my career.
You talked a few times about collaboration. You've used that word and collaborating with people. Are you a big networker? Are you kind of out there meeting tons of people in the community? Is that just how you operate?
I'm not at all by the traditional sense. Like when I think about this again now because I have kids and before kids it was so much easier to like do stuff like that, like go to a screening and schmooze with people, and that's just never really been me. Like I'm, despite having a podcast and coming on interviews like this, I'm actually an introvert. I get so tired. Like I can go to one of those events for like an hour and come home and just sleep for like 3 days after. So like this stuff one-on-one is great, but the group events and like the networking stuff, like not to say it's not effective. It was never for me. So one of the reasons, I developed a podcast over the years, it wasn't actually why I developed it. I should say it's probably the reason I've continued to do it. Is that I've been able to meet so many amazing people in a way that's very organic. So it wasn't an attempt to network with anybody, but just by default, I end up spending an hour talking to someone like yourself or, some other filmmaker or artist or whoever. And then by the end of it, it doesn't always happen, but maybe one or two times out of 10, we kind of really hit it off and we end up working on something together, or we just keep each other in mind for stuff in the future. And so for me, networking it is very important, but it not in a way where I consciously think about doing it. It's more about building value, shared value for people. So whether that's a podcast interview where there's multiple people that are collaborating, if you want to call it that, on a conversation or an idea to talk about something, and then it's valuable for me and it's valuable for them to get their message out, or it's like doing a film, like a no budget or a very micro budget film, and working with new crew members, new actors I haven't worked with before. And then those become new parts of my network as well. And I become part of their network. So yes, it's very important, but I think the distinction is it's like in a non like traditional sense of how most people think about networking. To me, it's more about just like making stuff and meeting people naturally through those processes.
Well, it's really interesting what you said because I mean, tell me a little bit about the genesis of the podcast. Like, why did you start a podcast? You have a podcast. You've had 300 episodes. You started it what 2019? You said
In 2017.
2017. You started.
Around, yeah, summer
I mean,
2017.
no one was podcasting in 2017. I mean, you
There
were
were-
kind of on the cutting edge at that point.
Well, honestly, it was a couple of things. One was I had the most stressful probably 6 months that I'd had, up until that point, work-wise. So I had landed this really big job for a major studio doing on the service production side. So my company was producing these commercial pieces basically for a big studio. And it was like the most amount of money that I'd ever dealt with at the time, the most amount of crew, 100-person crew, multiple day shoots. And I was like learning so much as I went. And then right after that, it went really well, but again, it was just personally stressful because it was like an area of growth. I went into this micro budget, what ended up being the first micro budget feature that I made and released, this movie called Shadows on the Road. And I made that not knowing, again, what I was doing in many ways, which is always how I do things. But I went through the process of making that film, and I'm very proud of what we made. I think everyone had a good time, but I was very personally stressed and taxed on that film because I would be working, until 2 a.m, coming home, figuring out where we were shooting the next day, totally disorganized, texting people the call time. The van that we rented would be running out of gas on the way, and I'd see it on the side of the road with our DP driving it. Like just every possible thing that could go wrong did. And after that shoot, I got physically like pretty sick for a few months. Not anything like dire or catastrophic, but I was just so run down, my energy, I was like, I'm not in a good physical space. Um, and I was starting to feel like I need to change how I'm working a little bit to be, I'm doing like too much and I'm doing things in a way that's like not sustainable. And around the same time, I started listening to some podcasts and I was thinking like, oh, this seems like a way to work that is, I could do it from home. Like I could, not that that's going to change like making movies. I always want to make movies, but maybe if the podcast can grow, I don't have to do as much service production work, which was super stressful at the time, probably the biggest stress for me at the time. And to me, the podcast was a way of like exploring this new terrain that I felt like I could add something to it. But if it went well, it could potentially replace a part of my working life that was particularly challenging and stressful for me, which by the way, it did not have that effect at all. But it did open up all these other doors and it did help me, that whole process helped me just think about working more sustainably in general. And even though it hasn't directly always tied in only with the podcast, that moment is still something like I think about to this day. If I'm going to say yes or no to an opportunity, I really think about it through the lens of like, what's the personal toll it's going to take on me, and is that worth it for whatever that opportunity may be?
It's so important, just understanding yourself, your capabilities, and it seems like you're just really in tune with that, like what you need. Just even understanding, I can't go to networking events because it drains my social battery.
Yeah,
And
it does.
but I could talk to someone on a podcast, and so I'm going to change the way I operate. So I'm having more one-to-one conversations and having to go to these big events where I'm more uncomfortable than comfortable.
Totally. And that's exactly it. It's like, I think something I try to talk to with filmmakers or other people like younger students and people that sometimes ask me questions or for advice, like the best advice I could give, at least from what I've experienced myself, is really to focus on your strengths and build around those as opposed to trying to, I mean, you always want to improve on your weak areas too, but instead of, if you're not great at something and you work 40 hours a week on that one thing, you may become pretty good at it, but you may never be really amazing at that thing. I'd rather take the stuff that I'm naturally pretty good at and put 40 hours a week into that, because you don't have to be good at everything. You only have to be good at a few things. And I think when you focus on your strengths, you can also create kind of a working dynamic, whether that's your own business or a film or just how you operate within the job that you may have at a company or whatever you're doing. But you can really create your own system that is unique to you. Like, so for me, all the things that I do on paper are very disjointed. Like I like filmmaking, I like podcasting. I'm into like color grading. So one of the other components of my business is creating post-production tools and selling those tools through my website, which I do every week. And all of those things, again, on paper would be like totally disjointed. But for me, in terms of like how I feel or how I operate day to day, it's very connected. It's just me going through a creative process of like, what am I going to work on this week? And how does the film idea that I have connect to a blog post? And how does that connect to a podcast? And how does that connect maybe to a product I'm going to sell? Like it's kind of its own ecosystem where these parts that to someone else would be completely random are kind of unified for me. And I think everybody has their own version of that they can do. But I think you kind of have to start by identifying what you're good at and how you want to work and what you don't want to do, and then kind of continue to refine whatever your specific kind of cocktail or recipe is, I guess, from there.
Yeah, that's great. Let's pivot a bit to your creative process in filmmaking. Let's talk a little bit about that. So, where do you come up with your ideas? Are they from kind of your own experience? Are they just kind of things that you are thinking about? Give us a sense of where creativity kind of starts for you.
A lot of it, honestly, is music, whether it's directly music or not. But like I'll say, like some of my earliest films, if you can even call them that I would have ever made, it was like hearing a new Radiohead album and just thinking like, oh my God, this is like blowing my mind. I need to make some visual to go with this. So it would just be this very music based thing. And I think as I've gone on in life and in filmmaking, it's not always like I'm listening to a song. It's not as direct as that anymore, where I'm like listening to a song and I want to make something for it. It's more about capturing an energy or a mood. So I might be like anywhere. I might just be like waiting for a train somewhere or walking around Disneyland or wherever it is, and just observing there's some kind of uh, state, whatever it is. Like there's a sunset going down in Malibu, and it's a little creepy because there's also a guy leaning on his car, like smoking a cigarette and looking a bit sinister. And it's like there's just sometimes moments that I catch that I'm like, oh, that's a mood. Like in the same way that a song can just, you can put it on and it just puts you in this different state of mind. Sometimes there's moments in real life that have that sort of texture, and I'll kind of mentally note those things, and then I'll come back to them and say like, what is that, like why is that thing resonating with me? And so that's one component of it. The other component, though, are just ideas that I might have, whether it's for a character or a story, or like I had this one idea I'm working on now that is totally very like character driven. There's almost like no plot to it. It's a hugely character driven thing. But it was a newspaper article I read on this person. I don't want to say too much yet because I'm actually going to make this movie. But this person that did something like really not good, and I was like, oh, like that. What compelled that person to do that? So I'll have these kind of fragments of ideas, whether they're like people, news clippings, just ideas that pop in my head, scenes that I've like experienced in real life that have had kind of like an emotional charge to them. And then I will look for ways to combine them. And I might say like, oh, that cool like setting I saw at the beach works really well with that character. What's a scene I could write for that? And it's a very additive process where I kind of build it up from there. And then where it becomes more subtractive is once I have multiple ideas, like I have a list, like most filmmakers, of dozens of different ideas. Some are terrible, some are good, but like there's lots of them on my notes. And I'll go through, and then I'll start to look at like what's the right idea for now, like for me to make right now. Like what's the thing that is either achievable within my means, or that I could potentially raise money for, that I know the actors for, I have access to the location. So I'll kind of build it up and then filter them down based on what's realistic or doable. And then that usually leaves me with like one or two ideas from a big list of 100. And then, at a certain point, you kind of go with your gut and say, like, that's the movie I would want to see. So I'm going to just get, it's always a gamble. So I'm going to make that one because I feel like that's the one to do. And then I go for it. So that's sort of been how it's evolved, I guess. If there's any method to that madness, I guess that would be the description of it.
What is it in the gut that tells you this is the one, or this is the idea to chase?
It's hard because it's usually, I think a lot of it is like that question of, is this something you would personally pay to see? Because I think there's a lot of ideas that I've had ideas for like for example, comedy. Like I remember this one idea I came up with a long time ago, and I was like, wrote the log line, and I was like, oh, this is like a funny idea for someone else to make, for like Adam Sandler or like some other comedian to like go and make this movie. But like that's not me. Like I'm not going to be 2 years into that process and still invested in this idea. So it has to be the thing that, I would really go and pay, whatever amount of money to go and see that in a theater, and I would go see it again the next weekend. And when it feels like something that specific, and that I would want to see as a fan, then that's how I know I'll want to commit to it, because these projects take 1 to 2 to 3 years for a feature film, and by the end of it you could be really burned out on an idea. So for me, a big part of it is just making sure that whatever the concept is something that you're genuinely attached to in some way, which I haven't always been. I've sometimes picked things that I thought were fun, and then it wasn't as attached to them as I thought it would be. So now that's been more my North Star.
Yeah, the attachment. And really, yeah, it
Yeah,
sounds like not just a good idea, but something that you're just attached to, committed to, and willing to see through, right?
exactly. Yeah, something that like when the going gets tough, because it will. Like everything sounds good when you first think of it, and you only think of the good, not the bad. But it's like, what's the version of this idea where like even if everything went wrong, I would still have it in me to finish this and put it out there. And that usually helps filter it out. And if I'm really down to it, and there's just like two ideas, and they're really equally both speaking to me, like a lot of it's just being pragmatic about it and what's the thing I could do first. I'll always prioritize the thing that I can do now over the thing that like may happen later, even if it's like, I could do a smaller movie now versus a bigger movie maybe in 2 years. I'd rather do the smaller movie now because the bigger one may never happen, and I feel like it's almost your responsibility as a filmmaker or as an artist, whatever your discipline is, to make your art and use whatever means you have. And I think for the bigger projects, one thing I've learned over the years too is like those don't have to be, it doesn't have to be either or. Like the bigger projects, you can always develop those and try to raise money and have those going in the background. But that doesn't mean you can't make something small while you're doing that, or vice versa. So I think having a couple irons in the fire is always important.
Now, your current film is called Teacher's Pet.
Yep.
Talk a little bit about what inspired that. It's about psychological thriller, sort of it looks like, psychotic teacher student
Basically.
relationship, basically.
Yeah.
Um, but what inspired that one? Where did you come up with the idea for that?
So that was another one of those like character ideas that I had. So really tracing the whole story back, I met with my producer Sheldon, who reached out to me. We connected through a mutual friend who I knew through the podcast. So again, that's kind of the connection there. And he reached out. He said, "I'm looking to produce and finance a micro budget feature." And he'd produced movies before, but he's really from the distribution world, and he's really so savvy in that area. He's worked with lots of the studios and so forth, and so I was excited to talk to him about that, and he essentially wanted to get a bunch of different log lines. So I went through my notes and I picked out here are some different characters. Some of this stuff was already kind of more written than others. Teacher's Pet actually wasn't written at all. That was just this character idea of like I just thought it'd be interesting to see a teacher who's like a psychopath, basically, who's manipulating somebody in a way that's not the horror type of trope of they're chasing somebody down the hallway with a chainsaw, but they're psychologically manipulating them and they're using their mind to get to them, as opposed to just physically, hacking them up with a meat cleaver or something. So that was sort of my idea, but I didn't have a story or anything beyond that. And I sent Sheldon these 5 log lines, and he came back and he's like, "Okay, of the 5, I really like these 2. That one was Teacher's Pet, one was a different movie." And I then turned both of those into treatments and like hashed them out a little bit more and developed them. And then he came back and he's like, "I really like Teacher's Pet," because from his perspective, he comes from the distribution world, and that type of story, whether it's true crime or serial killer, like that's a whole subgenre that can perform really well, even if you don't always have big stars attached to the movie in lead roles. So he really liked that, and then I essentially wrote it. I don't know if you'd say on commission or not, but essentially that form where he asked me to write it. I wrote it. He gave some notes, and we went back and forth. And then a few months later, we had probably 7 months later, whatever it was, we had a draft that we were ready to actually make. And then the strikes hit, and then so we had to get paused for a few months, and then we eventually shot it, a few months after that.
Yeah, that's great. And you talk a lot in your blog and your podcast about budgets for films, and budgets shouldn't be a constraint. Talk a little bit about that, because it seems in film, the budget is everything.
Yeah.
Whether you're making a blockbuster or an indie film, you got to have, it's expensive. No matter what you're doing, it's pretty expensive. So how do
Yes.
you work around the budget constraints so you're producing the best possible story for what's probably oftentimes a very, very limited budget?
Yeah. I think it's a few things. It's a big question. It's an important one, but I think the biggest thing is just pick something that not only can you do on a low budget or a no budget production, but that would be better off for it. So if you make like a found footage, I'm not saying everyone should make a found footage movie, but let's say you make a found footage movie or a mockumentary, like those are genres that actually work better if you don't have a star, if they're lo-fi, if it's run and gun, if there's a little bit of rough around the edges. Those are genres that totally people should consider. But even if like I personally have done more traditional narrative stuff, but even then, I'm trying to lean into my influences that are more in the art house. Like a lot of my favorite films are these European art films that, if you were to watch them and really break it down with like modern filmmaking technology, you can make these movies for almost nothing because they're set in a couple of houses and there's just a few characters, and it's really about the mood and the atmosphere and what's not being said, as opposed to being like really explicit with like big visuals and explosions and all that stuff. So I think part of it is just having the taste for movies that are smaller, and understanding that those movies can still reach a lot of people and they can still benefit you a huge amount as a filmmaker. But what you never want to do is try to make a Marvel movie for $10,000, because you just never will, or even try to make something that's like not a Marvel movie but just should be made with more money, and you don't have enough, and then it's always going to look like you're cutting corners. It's better to find something where the budget is not a condition for it to be accepted as, as a good piece of art. So that's number one. Number two, in terms of like making stuff for nothing, like I made a feature called Disappearing Boy in the pandemic with no crew, because you couldn't really work with a crew at that time. So I came up with this idea and called my friend Josh, who's an actor who's great. And we went, and just like every couple of weeks, we went and shot a scene or two for this movie. And the movie was basically shot for nothing. I ended up paying the few actors that were on the project who would have volunteered, but I felt like nobody was working in the pandemic. I felt like I should at least pay them something, and it ended up being like $6,000 for that entire movie to get made. But if somebody else were to replicate that, and they had friends that were willing to do it for free, or they were partners, they had equity in the project, like they could have literally made that movie for $400 just buying lunch and pizzas and stuff like that. So I think like part of it, there's a couple of things. I think part of it is like you have to be willing to do a lot of the work. Like the less money that you have, the more work that you personally need to do yourself. So like I had to write, direct, edit, shoot, be my own sound person, like do every single job. So like, yes, it was almost free, but it was also a tremendous amount of my time and effort. So part of it's that. But the other part is, if you can't do all that yourself, then you need to bring people on board who are equal partners, and you need to give away potentially or share in the equity of your film with them, because they're contributing as much as you are, maybe more at times, and they need to be valued and they need to have ownership over the project. So really, like the biggest costs when you break down, I'm talking about on a micro budget level, if you're looking at making a feature for 20 or 30 or $40,000, like really you're paying for like camera rental, you're paying for probably a good DP, a good sound person, a couple of locations, and there's going to be a few other things from there. But even those initial expenses, like if you can find a location that you can shoot in for free, that's a huge part of your cost that's now zero. If you can shoot it yourself instead of working with a DP, you've saved a ton of money, or partner with the DP and give them back end points on the movie. And now you've saved a lot of money too. Shoot on the gear you have, or call up a rental house and ask them if they'll sponsor the film and loan you a camera for 2 weeks or whatever you need to do. Like if you could just go line by line and start itemizing things and knocking things off, you can actually achieve a lot for very little. But the last thing I'll say is that it's actually easier to do that when you're below a certain threshold, because once you have any amount of investment, if you have, even $75,000 or $100,000 that somebody's actually cut you a check to invest in your movie, at that point, I think you're obligated, just from an ethical standpoint, to be paying everybody and treating it like any other production. That's a very different thing than if you're putting it on your credit card and you're working with 3 or 4 friends to go and just make something on the weekends, as if you were in a band with them and you guys are doing a rehearsal or writing songs in a studio together. So it's like just a very different model. And I think once you have money, your crew, rightfully so, expects to be paid a certain amount because they know that you're a funded production. But once you don't have any money at all, in a weird way, it's kind of freeing, because then you just do things in the most, like scrappy DIY way that you can. And if people are down with that, then great, they come along for the ride. And if it's not for them, that's cool too. They don't have to jump on board, but at least everybody kind of knows what they're getting into.
Yeah. Obviously AI is having a big impact on your industry. How do you look at these AI tools out there and their ability? Is it a positive? Is it a negative? Is it kind of wait and see? I mean, how do you think about that?
I think it's like any technology. I think it's both. There's positives and negatives. Like the negatives are obvious. We don't want people being exploited, and filmmakers or actors or artists who are making human made work to just have that. That's the big concern for everybody, is we don't want our stuff just ripped off by OpenAI and then somebody's just prompting, I want to make Teacher's Pet 2 now. And then all the work that we did over the last couple of years then just gets put into their machine, and now somebody spits out a new version of that. I'm actually not that concerned about that myself, because I've experimented so much with these platforms, not for my own personal use. I actually will not, like, I have no interest. I wrote a whole article on this just this week. I have no interest in using AI to replace the creative process, because that's literally the whole point of being creative, is to go through that process. And as like, people have heard that a million times, but it's so true. If you make a film, it can suck at times making the film, but the thing you remember when you're done is the making of the film. It's not the finished product necessarily. And so for me, I have no interest, no matter how good or how bad these tools become, of just like prompting a movie, because then I'm just cutting myself out of the thing that I want to be doing. So the whole point is to not be on my computer all day. I want to be with actors in the field shooting something weird, probably, and having fun doing it. But where I think that AI will be helpful, and is already helpful, is that every filmmaker is already using AI. Some of them recognize it, some don't. But if you're using, Google now, you're using AI. It's filtering your chat, your search results through its LLM model. If you're doing research, if you're doing, like, you guys are in the audio space, there's people that are, uh, there's these tools now that are out there to clean up background noise that are AI powered. There's finishing tools for color that are not cutting people out of the process, but they are helping you as the artist to do things faster in a way that, like, if I'm going to use a noise canceling filter in Final Cut Pro, like, to me, it doesn't really matter if that filter is powered by AI or powered by whatever other technology. It's still doing the same thing. I'm going to use that filter no matter what. So I think in that way, it's going to make it easier for artists who want to make real art to spend more time on the creative process and less time stuck in the weeds of, like, how do I remove that background noise? But I think that on the flip side, it's also going to open the door for people to make like really low level quality stuff that's just prompted. But I don't see that ever as a direct competitor for, let's say, indie films, because if somebody wants to watch like the thing that just came out last week of Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise fighting on a rooftop, on Seed Dance or whatever made it, it's like those aren't the same kind of people that are going to want to watch my, little indie DIY movie. So it's just as again, I will never pretend to know where things are going or that I have a crystal ball. But I think about this a lot, and I do think that, in a way, it's similar to VR. When virtual reality really started to have a resurgence a few years ago, everybody was saying nobody's ever going to want to go to the movie theater again. People are just going to sit at home, and every movie's going to be now made for VR. And all these years later, like, it was basically a total dud as far as filmmaking is concerned. There's a use case for it in gaming and maybe even in immersive documentaries and other things. But it by no means, like, theatrical is hurting because of other things, but not because of VR. And I think the same is true of AI. I think it will basically become its own little genre, and that will be like the AI made stuff. And some people may be into that. I don't know. Some people may not. Maybe it's a novelty. Maybe it'll last. I have no idea. But I think that'll be a separate thing. And I think for everyone else, AI will just be a technology that's embedded as it currently is into everything that they use on their computer. And it will probably make them a little bit more efficient at what they're already doing, so they could hopefully be more creative and spend less time getting stuck on technicalities.
And it could potentially give independent filmmakers more tools, right? Because in the past, if you wanted to do things that maybe were bigger budget, it just was out of the question. You just couldn't do it.
Yeah.
Whereas now you might be able to pull it off with some of these AI tools if
Yeah.
it works within your story.
Exactly. And you may work with let's say a visual effects artist who says, sure, I can do this VFX shot that you want. Normally it would be X amount of dollars, and you don't have the budget for that. If you want me to use this AI tool that I have, presumably it's one that is not like stealing anything copywritten or anything like that. It's like a legit tool that they've maybe even developed or whatever it is, they vouch for it, and they say, I can do your job now that you want for like a tenth of the price or a tenth of the time. I think those things are here to stay. And I think honestly, just from a practical standpoint, like there's no sense in fighting against it. Like these AI tools are here. And if you're a filmmaker and you're doing it for the right reasons, I think it almost shouldn't matter what happens with AI, because personally speaking, like, of course I want as many people to see my films as possible over the long term. But if nobody saw them, if 5 people saw them in a screening room, I would still make it because I enjoy making it. And with AI, it's like, it sure, like maybe it turns filmmaking into the theater. Maybe in 10 years, we go to New York or LA, and instead of there being lots of movie theaters, there's like 3 movie theaters in each city, and they're playing, it's almost more of the Broadway kind of model. And I'm okay with that if that's what it becomes, and there's more online distribution. I don't want that to be the case. I wish that we lived in like a different era where everybody is just running in the movie theater. We're all nostalgic for that, but you can't really fight against reality. So you have to kind of just accept that this is where the technology is going, and we are barely even scratching the surface. Like in 3 years from now, like this conversation will be so outdated because who knows what's going to be available. Well, this will just be two, fake avatars of us talking to each other or something. But yeah, I just think we're heading into new times, and it's important to, as much as this seems like a dichotomy, like embrace the new technology without sacrificing kind of your integrity as a filmmaker and the things that matter to you. And I think there's a way to do that.
Yeah, you're so right though. With the speed of technology, have you played around with Notebook LM at all?
I haven't, no.
So Notebook LM, it's a Google tool, and you can go in, and I did this. I wrote a book, so I uploaded my book into Notebook LM, and I said generate a podcast based
Yeah.
on the book. And they had a podcast with 3 hosts, and they were just riffing on the book and talking about it and making corny jokes, and it was,
Amazing.
summarizing the different things. I was like, oh man, yes. To your point, there may not be a human podcast
That's
at some
crazy.
point.
But you
It
know
is
what I
wild.
think on that topic, that I haven't tried that at all, but that's crazy. But I think that like where artists are protected is that I think that most fans of art, whether they're fans of a celebrity or somebody who's just a filmmaker starting out that has 10 fans, it doesn't matter whatever level you're at. I think people are invested in you as a human and you as a person. And so like take music, for example. There are these tools that are capable of making like decent sounding, like the average person may hear a track made by AI and like not know if it's AI or human anymore. But at the end of the day, they're not going to pay, $1,000 to go to Coachella to hear that. They want to see the artist on stage who is like, maybe going to do something they shouldn't do or like collapse or what. Like they want the spontaneity of the real moment, or they want the backstory. They want to listen to like one of the reasons I think the country genre and hip hop have been so dominant in their respective audiences is because people really connect to the stories behind the artists and these people that have they relate to, or that they had a struggle or a journey that they can connect to. And I think that like there's a reason why certain genres of music in particular even are more resilient than others, because there's more of a human connection that people have to the artist. And this is another thing I mentioned in the article, but I think if somebody goes to a movie and there's a celebrity that they love. You think of like a teenager or whoever it is going to a movie and they're obsessed with the celebrity that's in the movie. It's like in the back of their mind, there's a 1 in a billion chance. Maybe one day they'll meet that celebrity, and like maybe one day they'll like, actually see them in person at the grocery store or whatever. There's that tiny sliver of fantasy that they have in their head. It makes them want to go and see the movie. So if you're going and seeing the movie and it's effectively just a 3D animation of some type, as photorealistic as it may feel, it takes away that human connection to the material. Even if it was false to begin with, it still felt real to the person. And that's where I see it really disrupting certain, like animation, for example. I can see AI disrupting animation very, very quickly, more so than live action, other than augmenting the live action process. Because I think with animation, it's like nobody cares how it was made, unfortunately. Like I would rather honestly see like a hand-drawn cell-by-cell animation or a claymation. I love analog stuff like that. But if there's like a kid on TV, like watching TV, and they're watching Coco Melon, and it was made by AI or made by, some VFX company somewhere, like that kid doesn't care. So I think there's certain genres it's going to impact in a disproportionate way if I had to guess. But again, I know as little as anybody else.
So, around the topic of music, let's talk about your approach to music. You said before that sometimes music actually inspires the stories you tell, but how do you pick the right song to go along with your films and make sure that it's complements the story, it doesn't overwhelm it, but it's really kind of a key part of the visual communication?
Yeah. Well, now my approach is different than it used to be, but I think in a better, more effective way. So now because I'm so influenced by music, I wait to add music until the very, very last moment possible. Not that I do it quickly, but I used to use a lot more temp music and kind of workshop things and try this or that and kind of cut to the music. Now I do the exact opposite. I do multiple passes. I try to get as close to a picture lock as possible with no music in the edit. And by doing that, I know that if a scene can work really well on its own, then it's only going to be better when really good piece of music is dropped under it. But on the flip side, if you make a scene work because it's leaning on music as a crutch, and then you pull out the music and it doesn't work, then there's something fundamentally wrong with that scene, or you haven't pushed it far enough, or somebody's going to get bumped by that, no matter how good the music is. So now, really, what I try to do is, yeah, go through a cut, 2 or 3 more passes after that. Get it feeling like if I had no score at all, this would still be totally presentable. The other thing that helps me do, because I'm also doing sound design as I go, is I'm layering in the background textures and stuff. Like Soundstripe has like all these amazing sound effects and Foley and all these different things that I'm pulling in. So that also, if I'm mixing in my own music and I'm doing everything myself, as I often am, then I don't feel obligated to make certain choices out of convenience. Like I'm just going to leave the music in here because now I don't have to do any footsteps or whatever. It's like, no, I've done the footsteps. I'm going to choose what's best for this scene. So that's kind of part one of the process. In terms of picking the right music, a lot of it's just like listening to stuff that I love and trying to define the palette, the musical palette, in the same way that I would like a visual palette, by like restricting it. I really like scores that do something specific, where there might only be like 3 or 4 instruments, and sometimes there's like something unusual, like there's a horn instrument or something in there that you wouldn't expect, but like it totally works for that film. And so I'll try to just listen and get lots of inspiration from different soundtracks and find things that work. And usually what ends up happening on, let's say, a feature, is I might find, anywhere from like 4 to 7 cues, let's call it, from different movies, probably 1 or 2 from each movie, and maybe there's like 3 different movies. And somehow they feel connected to me. They may be very different on the surface, like one may be orchestral, one may be electronic, for example, but there's still something that feels right, whether it's in the tempo, whether it's in the emotion, whatever it is. There's something that connects them for me. And then once I have my almost picture lock, I'll start dropping those in. When I send that to a composer, if I'm working with a composer, it depends. Sometimes Sometimes it's like a Soundstripe or it's library stuff, or I might even try to more recently write music myself. But that's very early, so I can't really speak to that process as much. But let's say I'm working with a composer, which normally I had in the past. I would send him what I have, and I would basically kind of ask him to help me make sense of it, of like, these are the things that feel right in the movie. And more often than not, this my composer, his name's Craig Saltz, who's fantastic. We've worked together on many, many projects. And part of the reason I love working with him is not only is he good, but we've worked together so much that he knows, like, when I send him an edit like that, it almost goes without saying, like, what he needs to do and what I need to do. And so he can go through and, without doing like a sound alike, he can create something that's kind of like, a cousin of that. It's its own thing. It may have a different melody, different instruments, but it still lives in the same emotional world. Because the best thing I think you could do as a director when you're working with a composer, especially if you don't have any musical background, is just speak to them in terms of emotion. And it's less about like, oh, I want this in a certain key, or, I want these instruments, and like getting too specific when you don't really know how to verbalize what you're asking for can just confuse them. So I think it's actually better to just say, like, I want this to feel like very melancholy here. And then on this part, I want it to feel kind of like aggressive and fun, but just use like broader terms, and then they'll know how to interpret that. So it's kind of combining that language with some references and temp music that's put in later in the process, and that usually results in cues that then my composer is sending back to me that are like pretty close to being ready to go, and then we just kind of dial them in a little bit with some feedback. But that's basically been the process, for the last couple of films.
It's interesting. I've talked to a couple filmmakers on this show, and they've all said the same thing about the relationship with their composer. They found a composer who kind of gets what they're trying to do. They've worked together for several films, and it just becomes easy. So I guess the advice is find a composer who gets you.
Yeah.
And that'll really pay
work
off.
with the same person until you get each other. Like, it wasn't always like we always were friends and had a good time working together, but it wasn't always as fluid as it is now. And I think that advice honestly extends even beyond composers and anyone you're working with. Like, if you're working with a DP, some DPs, every DP knows, like, the directors they work with are going to be different. One's going to be super hands-on and know everything about what lens they want, and the other one is never going to have touched a camera in their life, and they have no idea, and they're focused on something else, and that's cool too. There's no right or wrong. But yeah, I think the value of working with the same people over and over again is that you guys get to develop that shorthand, and whether it's a composer or DP or anyone else on your team, I think that don't expect for perfection from anyone right off the bat, nor should they expect you to be perfect, but like, give each other a shot over multiple films. And if it starts to move in the right direction, that's a good sign. And eventually 5 films in or 10 films in, you guys are just, have a really good kind of working dynamic.
Yeah, that's great. I always ask people, whether they're filmmakers, musicians, I mean, what's your gear kit look like? What are you using to shoot?
Most things I use, like these days, if I have my choice, I'll just rent an Alexa 35 because that camera looks so good. And living in a big market, like I'm in LA, but if you're in a big city, I can't speak to every city, but like, you can now rent an Alexa 35 for like a few $100s a day. And this is a camera that, is like hundreds of thousands of dollars when it's all set up with media and accessories and everything. So if I could just pick any camera to work with, that is, I love film. I shoot on film. I own a 16 millimeter camera, 8 millimeter cameras, 35 for stills. Like I've shot every format and I love film. But the closest to film digitally is the Alexa 35. So I'll always rent that when it's available. If I can't, like I have right here, this camera I just shot on, I'll give a shout out to Blackmagic. This is the Ursa 12K. So this is like a really good, really good cinema camera as well. The files are huge because it's 12K resolution. But that does give you a lot of options in post. But honestly, my day-to-day camera is a Fuji X-T4. It's a small, now several-year-old little Fuji mirrorless camera that I love because I'm a big, proponent of good color science. And I love good colors really speak to me almost more than any other capability of a camera. And the Fuji line just delivers like some of the best camera, like colors on a camera, I think outside of Alexa, or Apple. I'll say this, anyone using an iPhone, I did a camera test recently, did a camera shootout with the Alexa 35, iPhone, Red, Sony FX6, 11 cameras total. And the one that was the closest to the Alexa in terms of color was the iPhone. So yes. So to answer your question,
Wow.
my daily driver is a Fuji. But for anyone listening to this that like doesn't even have, a mirrorless camera or something like that, it's like use your phone. Like that advice is like as good or as it's ever been. It's really capable of so much if you know what you're doing with it.
That's great. That's great. So if you could give 18-year-old Noam Kroll one piece of advice or nugget of wisdom, what would that be?
I would say I would probably give myself the advice to not second guess my unusual instincts as much, because anytime I've really gone off the rails with my filmmaking or just found myself in a lull, it's always been when I took the traditional wisdom and instead of looking at what I was doing that actually worked and just doing more of that, I might hit a lull naturally, as everyone has ups and downs. You never have a pure linear growth in everything, but I would often hit a lull and then say, I need to blow up everything and rethink this. I need to get a job somewhere, or I need to, start a different kind of business or stop making films or whatever it was. And I would waste time and then end up coming right back to where I was anyway. So I wish I could have shortcutted that process and just known that like, there's always going to be ups and downs. And when there's a down, that doesn't mean anything that you're doing is not correct. That just means that there's something to be improved upon, or there's some external or internal circumstance that you have to recognize that needs to be addressed. But that doesn't always mean you have to fundamentally tear down your entire approach. You should lean into the things that you're good at.
Noam, well, thanks for being here. Great conversation. Where could people learn more about you, get information with you, connect with you?
Appreciate you having me, first of all. And yeah, if anyone wants to follow along, I send a newsletter every Sunday to filmmakers with just kind of tips and advice like this, some of the stuff we talked about. So anyone that wants to get it can find it at noamkroll.com. It's spelled NOAMKROLL.com/newsletter. And if you sign up, you'll get emails once a week on Sunday. I'll send you some tips and advice. Otherwise, I'm on Instagram, YouTube, Twitter or X at Noam Kroll, Facebook as well. So you can find me on all the usual platforms.
Noam, thanks again. If you like this episode, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube page and follow us on your favorite podcast platform. And we'll see you at the next Soundstripe session. Soundstripe is the leading music licensing platform, offering the highest quality music produced by award-winning artists and innovative tools to find the perfect song for your project. Soundstripe has over 100,000 audio tracks along with sound effects and video assets. We provide comprehensive licensing coverage, whether it's a broadcast TV spot, social media video, or podcast. Soundstripe helps turn an average video into an unforgettable story. Learn more and sign up for a free account at soundstripe.com.